Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The flight begins. Kevin's steps echoed in the bustling terminal, lost in a sea of hurried travelers. His tall frame cut through the crowd with an air of calm determination, each stride purposeful. He adjusted his leather carry-on bag, its worn edges barely visible under the subtle sheen of his tailored suit. For a man who had spent his career in the cockpit, there was a certain peace he found in airports, surrounded by the familiar hum of planes and the rush of passengers. Today, however, he couldn't shake the feeling that this particular flight would be different. His destination was a business conference on the West Coast, but what he didn't expect was that this flight, an ordinary means to an end, would lead to a life-altering event. He took a deep breath, the scent of jet fuel filling his senses as he moved closer to the gate. The low murmur of voices and the whir of rolling suitcases blended into the background as he reached the boarding line. Ahead, Sarah stood at the gate, checking boarding passes with her usual efficiency. As Kevin stepped forward, the briefest flicker of recognition passed between them. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she glanced at him, her once friendly smile now replaced with a look of quiet disdain. Kevin, always one to keep his composure, nodded politely, offering his boarding pass with the professionalism that had become second nature to him. The interaction felt strange, like an invisible weight had settled between them, one that had nothing to do with the flight itself. Sarah's coldness was palpable. She looked him over, her gaze lingering on his tailored suit, then flicking down to the worn leather bag that carried the remnants of his career, his pilot's license. A frown tugged at the corners of her mouth, and with a barely concealed sneer, she motioned to the economy line. "I think you're in the wrong place, sir. Economy boarding is that way." Her words stung, but Kevin's face remained impassive. He didn't let her words break his stride, and he certainly didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he passed her, offering nothing but a courteous nod as he continued toward the jet bridge. He heard her mutter something under her breath, the words unclear but undeniably judgmental. He wasn't sure if it was directed at him, but the sharpness of her tone sent a surge of irritation through him. Still, he pushed it down, determined not to let her ignorance ruin his journey. The walk down the jet bridge to the plane felt like a slow march through an invisible gauntlet. Around him, fellow passengers moved past, some oblivious to his presence, others casting him curious glances. Kevin was used to it. It was the same on every flight. Whether it was the look of confusion from passengers who couldn't understand why he was flying first class or the occasional, pointed silence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Once on the plane, the familiarity of the first-class cabin offered a small sense of solace. Kevin stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, feeling a quiet sense of pride at how far he'd come. His eyes scanned the cabin as he made his way to his seat. He was well aware that some passengers would regard him with curiosity, perhaps even disbelief. After all, a black man in first class didn't always fit the stereotypical mold. He settled into his seat with a sigh of relief, closing his eyes for a brief moment as the hum of the engines began to fill the cabin. It was a sound that had become both a source of comfort and determination over the years. This was his world, the cockpit, the sky, the freedom of flight. But as he opened his eyes and looked around, the unease that had been growing inside him returned. Kevin's gaze flicked to Sarah, who was now moving through the cabin with the drinks cart, a tight smile plastered on her face as she served the first-class passengers. She approached an elderly couple seated across from Kevin, her tone syrupy sweet as she asked, "What can I get you today?" Her attitude had shifted entirely. Gone was the cold dismissal, replaced with practiced warmth. Kevin clenched his jaw as he watched the contrast. Sarah's sudden change in demeanor wasn't lost on him. He'd dealt with enough racism in his career to know the signs. Her actions had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with her biased perception of who he was. But Kevin wasn't here to fight her. He was here to relax, to get through the flight without incident. When Sarah finally reached his row, her smile faded into something colder, almost venomous. She set a napkin and a cup of water down on his tray table, the movement sharp and dismissive, spilling some of the water over the rim. Kevin could feel her eyes on him, as if daring him to say something. But he remained silent, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain as she turned away. Kevin's grip on the armrest tightened for a moment as her words stung, but he reminded himself not to engage. He wasn't about to let her dictate how he would spend the next few hours. Still, the frustration lingered, gnawing at him. As she moved on to the next passenger, the cabin grew quieter, and the air felt heavy with the tension she had created. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some sympathetic, others awkwardly avoiding any confrontation. An elderly woman seated a few rows behind leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Did you see that? The way she treated him." Her husband nodded, his face etched with concern. "It's wrong. Someone should say something." But no one did. The unspoken rule was clear: stay out of it. Kevin had learned that lesson too many times in his life. Silence, in many ways, was the safest response. It was easier to turn away, to pretend not to see. But Kevin knew better. He knew the weight of silence all too well. As the flight continued, the cabin's atmosphere became more and more uncomfortable. Sarah's behavior remained consistent, smiling and charming toward the other passengers, but cold and distant whenever she reached Kevin. At one point, she passed by him again, offering him a fresh cup of water without a word. The small gesture felt like an afterthought, an attempt to appear civil without actually making any effort to change her behavior. Through it all, Kevin maintained his composure. He refused to let her prejudice define him or his experience. His thoughts drifted to the many hours he'd spent training, studying, and perfecting his craft as a pilot. He remembered the long nights, the failures, and the small victories that had led him to this moment. He was here on merit, not charity. But as much as he tried to ignore the simmering resentment inside him, he knew it wouldn't be long before the situation would escalate. The turbulence of life, as he knew all too well, was often inevitable. And sometimes, the world tested your resolve in ways you could never anticipate. Little did Kevin know, this flight would soon reveal just how far his journey would take him, and the courage that would be required to face the challenges ahead. Tensions rise. As the plane ascended into the sky, the usual serenity of cruising at 35,000 feet enveloped the cabin, but the atmosphere within the first-class section was anything but peaceful. The turbulence from the earlier moments had passed, but an undercurrent of tension remained. Kevin's mind wandered back to the moment of his interaction with Sarah, replaying it again and again. There was an anger simmering just below the surface, but he quickly pushed it down, not wanting to let her narrow-mindedness rattle him further. He wasn't here for a confrontation, he was here to do what he loved best, to be in the sky, to let the miles unfold beneath him, and to find solace in the rhythmic hum of the engines. But the more he tried to center himself, the more he noticed the whispers, the sideways glances, and the heavy silence that settled between Sarah and him. It wasn't just her actions, it was the way the whole cabin seemed to shift uncomfortably in response to her behavior. Some passengers avoided looking at him altogether, others stole glances as if they didn't know how to respond, while a few exchanged uncomfortable glances with each other. They all knew what had happened, even if none of them had the courage to address it directly. Kevin couldn't blame them. It wasn't easy to confront injustice, especially when the perpetrator was someone in a position of authority. But it was wearing on him, the constant, invisible weight of being judged, of being seen through a lens that had nothing to do with who he was. He wasn't just Kevin, the man in the suit. To some people, he was a symbol of all their unconscious prejudices, a man whose worth was judged by his skin, not his skills. As he looked around, he saw the same familiar patterns, two middle-aged men in suits who had long since buried their heads in their laptops, avoiding eye contact with anyone. A young woman at the front of the cabin, looking nervously at her phone, a disapproving expression on her face as she seemed to monitor Sarah's behavior. There were even a few others who tried to keep their focus on their drinks or magazines, pretending not to notice the discomfort in the air. But Kevin saw it. He saw it all. And though he chose not to react, it was impossible to ignore how the situation was unfolding. He sighed quietly, leaning back in his seat as the flight attendants continued their rounds, pushing the cart down the aisles, offering drinks, snacks, and half-hearted smiles. Sarah, ever the professional when it suited her, passed by him again. She didn't meet his eyes. She didn't offer the smallest trace of warmth or acknowledgement. The gap between them seemed to grow with each interaction. Kevin knew what he had to do. He had to stay above it all, not let her actions define him. But it wasn't always so simple. "Water, sir?" Sarah's voice had an edge of forced politeness, almost as if she were doing him a favor. "Yes, please," Kevin replied, his voice steady, despite the unspoken tension between them. He accepted the water with a nod, offering nothing more than a faint smile. This time, however, Sarah's response was different. She barely handed him the glass, instead throwing it on his tray table with unnecessary force, causing a slight splatter of water to spill onto the napkin. Without a word, she turned away and moved on. Kevin's grip tightened around the armrest. His knuckles whitened. She was baiting him, hoping for a response. But he didn't give her the satisfaction. Still, the frustration welled up in him, twisting his gut into knots. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the constant microaggressions, the way people like Sarah seemed to think they were above him. The way they saw him as nothing more than a stereotype, a seat filler, an afterthought. It was tiring. And yet, he was all too familiar with it. There was a time when he would have fought back, challenged people like Sarah with every ounce of his being, but that was before he realized the futility of such encounters. People who harbored hate, who carried bias in their hearts, rarely changed in the heat of a confrontation. Instead, Kevin had learned to focus on what he could control, his response, his demeanor, and most importantly, his professionalism. Yet, despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the anger that was bubbling under the surface. It had always been a quiet, persistent companion in his life, this simmering frustration with a world that seemed to see him as less than he was. As much as he tried to push it down, it always resurfaced, usually in moments like these, when he was reminded of how hard he had to work to earn a seat at the table. To earn respect. His thoughts were interrupted as the flight continued on its course. The fastened seatbelt sign blinked off, and passengers relaxed slightly, taking out books, or pulling out headphones to watch movies. The hum of the cabin softened as the crew moved about more freely. But in the back of his mind, Kevin couldn't help but notice how the tone of the flight had shifted. The tensions had escalated, but not necessarily in the way he had expected. The elderly couple, who had initially taken note of Sarah's behavior, leaned across the aisle to speak quietly to him. "You okay?" the woman asked, her voice gentle, her brow furrowed with concern. "We couldn't help but notice how she treated you." Kevin smiled faintly, touched by her concern. "I'm fine, really," he said, his voice calm. "It's not the first time." The man beside her gave a small shake of his head, his face hardening. "It's disgraceful," what she said. "I know," Kevin replied, his voice softer now. He could feel the weight of their words, but the reality was, there wasn't much to be done. Some people just can't see past their own biases. The couple fell silent, exchanging glances, before the woman spoke again. "We've seen it all too many times. It's a shame, but we're glad you're keeping your head up." Kevin nodded, appreciating the gesture, but he knew this wasn't something that would change overnight. It was something that took years, even generations, to overcome. But as he looked around the cabin, at the many quiet, unspoken exchanges happening in every corner, he knew the real fight was far from over. He wasn't just fighting against Sarah's prejudice, he was fighting against a much larger societal battle. And it was a battle that required resilience, patience, and a lot of hope. As the flight progressed, Kevin found himself sinking deeper into his thoughts. His mind wandered to the years he'd spent climbing the ranks in aviation, the countless hours spent in simulations, the grueling training, and the relentless preparation to prove himself capable of taking control of any aircraft. He thought about the doubts he'd faced along the way. The subtle hints from colleagues, the looks from fellow pilots, the dismissive comments from passengers who didn't believe someone like him could possibly be a pilot. Yet, he never let it deter him. Kevin had always known he was more than the assumptions people placed on him. In the cockpit, he had proven himself countless times. But today, in the confined space of an airplane cabin, he found himself proving something else, to himself, to the passengers who witnessed Sarah's behavior, and perhaps most importantly, to Sarah herself. He was more than what she thought he was. He was more than her assumptions. As the flight continued its journey across the country, Kevin steeled himself for what lay ahead. The turbulence of life was only just beginning. But little did anyone on this plane know, this story wasn't going to end with silent tolerance. It was about to take a turn, and not just for Kevin, but for all of them. The truth revealed. Hours passed, and the flight moved steadily across the sky. The rhythmic hum of the engines had become a familiar lull that eased the cabin into a strange equilibrium. The tension that had been so palpable in the first-class cabin earlier had faded somewhat, replaced by the quiet murmur of passengers. Some had settled into their own worlds, retreating into books, music, or the in-flight entertainment system. Others napped, oblivious to the subtle shifts in the atmosphere that lingered. Yet, despite the outward calm, there was an undeniable undercurrent of anticipation, an energy that had started to pulse ever so slightly beneath the surface. Kevin was still wrestling with his thoughts. His encounter with Sarah had left a bitter taste in his mouth, but more than that, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding. He had seen how others had reacted to Sarah's behavior, many with discomfort, some with open disapproval, and even a few with a quiet, shared understanding. But none had stepped up. Not a single passenger had intervened or challenged her actions. It was as though they all feared getting involved, afraid of disrupting the uneasy truce that hung in the air. But as much as he tried to ignore it, Kevin couldn't help but feel that today was different. He had spent too many years in the cockpit of an aircraft, too many years silently battling against the assumptions placed upon him. And today, as he sat there, watching Sarah move through the aisles with her clipped demeanor and thinly veiled contempt, something in him stirred, a quiet, resolute determination that he could not ignore. His phone buzzed in his pocket, cutting through his reverie. He had turned it off for most of the flight, but as he glanced at the screen, he saw a message from an old friend, Jack, an aviation mentor and fellow pilot. The message was brief, but jarring. "Kevin, we've got a situation. They're calling for a response from the cockpit. Get ready." The message was cryptic, but the urgency in Jack's words was clear. Kevin's heart skipped a beat. What situation? What was happening? His mind raced. In all his years of flying, he had never been on a flight where something had gone this wrong. The only time a pilot would be asked for a response was if something was seriously wrong with the aircraft or if there was an emergency. His fingers moved instinctively to the button on his armrest, signaling the flight attendant call light. He hadn't planned on engaging with Sarah, but now the situation had taken a new turn, and he had no choice but to act. The seconds felt like hours before Alex, the young attendant from earlier, appeared at his side. His face was pale, his eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Johnson, I need to ask you to come with me," Alex said, his voice shaky. "There's been an issue in the cockpit. The captain, he's..." Kevin could hear the fear in Alex's voice, but he didn't need him to finish the sentence. Without a word, Kevin stood and followed the young man down the aisle. The entire cabin seemed to freeze as they passed. Some passengers watched curiously, others whispered in low tones, but none dared to speak out loud. As they approached the cockpit door, Kevin could hear raised voices from inside. The co-pilot, a seasoned veteran named Mark, was arguing with the captain. Kevin's stomach tightened. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm, though his pulse was racing. He knew it was rare for the captain to ever leave the cockpit in such a situation, especially with turbulence still rocking the plane. Alex's voice trembled as he answered, "There's been a medical emergency." "The captain, he passed out. The co-pilot is trying to stabilize him, but we need someone else to take over. The reality of the situation hit Kevin like a freight train. This wasn't a minor incident. This wasn't a simple issue that could be fixed with a quick adjustment or a phone call. They were in the air, far from any immediate help, and if the co-pilot couldn't regain control of the situation, things could spiral out of hand fast. Without hesitation, Kevin's mind snapped into focus. Training. Years of experience. The thousands of hours spent in the cockpit, preparing for moments just like this. It was time. The doubt, the frustration, the indignation, all of it melted away. This was no longer about Sarah or her misplaced assumptions. This was about his duty to every single person on this plane. He gave Alex a nod, signaling him to step aside. The young attendant opened the door slowly, and Kevin stepped into the cockpit. The air inside was thick with tension. The captain was slumped in his seat, unconscious, while Mark, the co-pilot, was frantically working on him. His hands were shaking, but his face was set in a grim line of concentration. "Mark," Kevin said, his voice strong, grounding the room in the certainty of his presence. "What's going on?" Mark looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. "The captain's had some kind of medical emergency. He's not responding. I can't stabilize him alone. I'm going to need you to take over." Without missing a beat, Kevin slid into the captain's seat, his mind already snapping into autopilot mode. He was no stranger to crisis situations, but the weight of this one was heavier than any he had ever faced. This was more than just a malfunction or a technical error. It was the lives of over 150 people resting in his hands. He turned his attention to the controls, his fingers brushing against the instruments, checking the altitude, the speed, and the systems. Everything appeared to be functioning well, aside from the emergency. The captain's lifeless body was slumped over beside him, and he couldn't afford to focus on that. It was a moment of raw, desperate professionalism that Kevin had honed over decades of flying. "Mark," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Get the medical kit. We need to stabilize the captain as best as we can." Mark scrambled to grab the medical supplies, his movements erratic with stress, but Kevin's steady hand on the controls brought a sense of calm to the cockpit. He was in charge now, and though the situation was dire, he had the skills and experience to keep things together. Outside the cockpit, the rumble of the plane shifted, the turbulence picking up once more. The aircraft rocked from side to side, and passengers could hear the occasional muffled shout from inside the cockpit. For a moment, Kevin could hear Sarah's voice, though muffled by the closed door. She was asking someone if everything was all right, her tone more panicked than professional. It was a strange contrast to her earlier behavior, but in that moment, Kevin paid no mind. There was too much at stake. "Get me a status update from the cabin," Kevin said, his voice crisp and measured. "We need to make sure everyone is aware of the situation." Mark quickly moved to the intercom, transmitting a calm announcement to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor issue in the cockpit. The captain has suffered a medical emergency, but we are working quickly to stabilize the situation. Please remain calm, and thank you for your cooperation." As the announcement filtered through the plane, a strange stillness seemed to wash over the cabin. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, but no one panicked. They trusted the professionalism of the flight crew. But Kevin knew the real truth: they weren't trusting the crew. They were trusting the man in the cockpit who knew exactly what to do. And as the plane soared through the sky, Kevin felt the weight of his responsibility. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He wasn't just a man sitting in a first-class seat. He was the captain of this aircraft, and every person on board depended on him to get them safely to their destination. Just as Mark began to assist the captain with CPR, Kevin's focus sharpened. He was in control now. The skies outside, though turbulent, were calm compared to the storm that had been brewing inside him. The story that had started with prejudice, with dismissive glances and whispered insults, was now leading to something far greater. A reckoning was coming, not just for Sarah, but for every person on board. This was more than a flight, it was a moment of transformation. Kevin wasn't just saving lives today. He was changing hearts. A new horizon. The moment was fragile, as though the very air around the aircraft had thickened with the gravity of what was unfolding. The turbulence, though steady, seemed to reflect the chaos inside the cockpit, where Kevin was now seated with an unwavering focus. His hands gripped the controls with the kind of determination that comes from years of experience, an experience that had prepared him for emergencies, but never for something like this. It was one thing to react to mechanical failures or bad weather. It was another to find yourself responsible for the lives of everyone on board when the captain, the man who had guided them thus far, lay unconscious beside him. Mark's hands were frantic as he continued performing CPR on the captain, his face a mask of stress and disbelief. He had been trained for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. Kevin knew it wasn't just about saving the captain now, it was about keeping the plane steady, keeping the passengers calm, and, ultimately, taking control of a situation that could escalate in ways no one could predict. Kevin's mind raced as he glanced at the instruments in front of him. Altitude, speed, airspeed, engine status, all were stable. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The aircraft was holding its course, which meant they had time. But how much? A sense of urgency began to creep into Kevin's thoughts. The time for hesitation was over. Mark had made no progress with the captain, and Kevin knew that every minute counted. He made a decision. "Mark," Kevin said, his voice clear but calm, cutting through the tense silence. "We need to get this plane on course. You need to get the captain stable, or I'll have to take over the emergency procedures." Mark's head snapped up. Sweat poured down his brow as he nodded grimly. "Understood," he said, though his voice was tight with fear. There was no time to waste. Kevin took a deep breath and leaned forward, his fingers moving swiftly across the console. He checked the autopilot system, ensuring it was holding the course. Then, without a second thought, he keyed into the flight systems to begin the long process of preparing for a possible emergency landing. His mind shifted into autopilot mode, an instinctive, trained response that had been drilled into him in countless simulations and real-life scenarios. Kevin's attention was drawn to the intercom system, which crackled to life as Mark relayed the emergency update to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are managing a medical emergency in the cockpit. We ask for your cooperation and understanding as we stabilize the situation. Please stay calm." The calmness of Mark's voice stood in stark contrast to the reality of the situation. It was a voice that seemed to reassure the passengers, but deep down, Kevin knew the true challenge had yet to come. The medical emergency wasn't just about the captain's health, it was about how this plane would make it to safety. It was about whether they could regain control before things spiraled out of hand. As the minutes ticked on, the decision to take over the emergency protocols became more urgent. Kevin knew that they couldn't keep flying indefinitely without a clear plan. If the captain didn't respond soon, they would have to make the hard call. The nearest airport was miles away, but there were smaller, closer options for an emergency landing. He glanced at the door. The sounds of murmuring from the cabin had become a low hum, and for the briefest moment, Kevin wondered if any of the passengers truly understood the magnitude of what was happening. He could see their faces in his mind, their confused, worried glances, the quiet uncertainty of people who had been trapped in this strange, middle ground between an ordinary flight and something much more extraordinary. And then, just as his mind began to make peace with the gravity of the situation, he heard the faintest stir from the captain. A subtle, but unmistakable shift. Kevin's heart skipped a beat. Was it possible? "Mark, wait," Kevin said urgently. "The captain's responding." "Check again." Mark's eyes widened as he leaned over, feeling for the captain's pulse once more. Then, with a sound that seemed to echo through the small confines of the cockpit, Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "He's alive. Barely, but he's breathing. We've got to keep him stable." The relief that flooded Kevin's chest was almost tangible, but it didn't last long. There was still work to be done. The captain's situation was critical, and even though he was breathing, Kevin couldn't let down his guard. The emergency procedures would still need to be followed. As the co-pilot worked to stabilize the captain, Kevin focused on the next task at hand, landing the aircraft. He keyed in the coordinates for the nearest airport that could handle an emergency landing, verifying wind conditions, runway status, and other critical data. His mind was a machine, a cold, calculating force that cut through all distractions. "Mark," Kevin said, without looking up, "prepare the cabin for descent. Tell them to brace for impact. We're making an emergency landing." The words felt surreal, like something from a movie or a nightmare. Yet the calmness with which Kevin spoke was the only thing that kept the chaos in check. In that moment, he was a pillar of stability. Outside the cockpit, the cabin was alive with whispers and a sense of unease. The passengers had been informed, but the realization was just beginning to settle in. Sarah, who had been silently watching the cockpit from the back of the cabin, suddenly stood up. Her usual air of superiority had disappeared, replaced with a deep, palpable concern. Kevin couldn't afford to focus on her, but he noticed the change. Sarah had never seen anything like this, never been so vulnerable. Her entire attitude had been built on a sense of control and superiority, but now, she was a mere passenger, one of the many people who relied on the professionalism of others to survive. Minutes later, the cockpit's alarms began to beep, signaling their descent. Kevin flicked the switches, slowly guiding the aircraft down toward the emergency runway. His focus was complete, his body moving almost without thought, like a well-oiled machine. The turbulence had subsided, the plane now a steady, controlled descent toward safety. The moment of truth arrived faster than expected. The wheels touched down on the runway with a bone-rattling thud, sending a jolt through the aircraft. Kevin fought to keep control, his hands gripping the controls tightly as he slowed the plane, expertly maneuvering it to the designated emergency exit zone. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane came to a complete stop. The sudden silence inside the cabin was almost deafening. The roar of the engines died away, leaving behind only the sound of heavy breathing and the soft click of seatbelts being unfastened. Mark, now working quickly to stabilize the captain, nodded at Kevin, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "You did it, Kevin. You kept it together. We made it." Kevin didn't respond immediately. His mind was still racing. The adrenaline had faded, but the weight of the responsibility he had shouldered lingered, pulling at him like an invisible force. He had faced a challenge that few could ever comprehend, but what stood out in his mind wasn't the crisis or the emergency landing. It was the moment he had decided to act. It was the realization that he had taken control when others couldn't or wouldn't. As the passengers began to disembark and medical teams rushed to the scene, Kevin took a deep breath. The world outside was clear, the skies now peaceful, the storm that had raged within the cockpit fading into history. And as Sarah passed by him on the way out of the plane, her eyes met his for a brief moment. Her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced with something far more humbling. Kevin didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had already said everything with his actions. The truth was undeniable. Courage, professionalism, and calm in the face of chaos had triumphed over the noise of judgment, the prejudices, and the assumptions of others. The horizon, stretching wide and clear ahead, was a symbol of that victory. It was a reminder that, no matter the storm, there was always a way through, if you had the strength to see it. And, in the end, it was not the plane that had been saved, it was the people aboard it.